The day started like any other travel day. The airport was busy with people rushing to catch flights, families hugging before goodbyes, and announcements echoing through the large halls. Among the many travelers, an elderly black woman slowly walked with her son by her side. She carried a small handbag close to her chest, and inside it was her most important possession, her medicine. It was something she needed to take regularly, and without it she could easily fall sick. Her son knew this well, and that is why he stayed close, making sure she was comfortable every step of the way. The son, tall and calm-looking, carried their carry-on luggage while keeping an eye on his mother. She was not used to flying often, and the whole process made her nervous. From the long lines at security to the loud voices around, she held her son's hand tightly for reassurance. He kept telling her, "It's okay, Mama. I'm right here." Those words comforted her, and she nodded quietly. She trusted her son, who had always taken care of her with patience and love. When they finally boarded the plane, the woman felt relief. She moved slowly down the aisle, careful not to bump into anyone. Her son helped her find her seat, and he gently placed her handbag in front of her. She liked to keep her medicine near because she sometimes needed it suddenly. Sitting down, she sighed, feeling the weight of the long walk through the airport lift off her shoulders. The cabin around them was filled with the sound of passengers settling in, opening overhead bins, and children asking questions with excitement. For a brief moment, it felt like everything was normal. The flight attendant in charge of their section walked down the aisle. She looked tired, her expression stern as she checked if everyone had buckled their seatbelts. Her voice was sharp as she reminded passengers of the rules. The elderly woman, trying to stay calm, placed her medicine bottle gently on the tray table in front of her. She wanted to make sure it was easy to reach if she needed it. She glanced at her son and smiled weakly, trying to show that she was fine, though the noise and movements of the busy cabin still made her uneasy. The son noticed the way the flight attendant eyed the bottle. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she stopped near their row. She leaned closer, her voice firm as she said, "You need to put that away. No items should be on the tray right now." The elderly woman looked up at her with surprise. She tried to explain softly, "This is my medicine. I need to keep it close." But the attendant cut her off, repeating her instruction with a cold tone. The son spoke gently, hoping to smooth things over. "Ma'am, this is her medicine. She needs it within reach. It's important for her health." But the attendant's expression did not soften. The atmosphere in their row shifted. The elderly woman held her son's hand tightly again, her heart beating faster. She was not used to confrontations, and she hated drawing attention. She whispered to her son that it would be okay, but inside she felt a growing worry. All she wanted was to keep her medicine safe and near her, nothing more. Her son, however, was already sensing that this situation might not end simply. He looked around the cabin, noticing that other passengers were watching quietly, curious about the interaction. The minutes before takeoff always carried a mix of stress and anticipation. Passengers expected a calm environment as the plane prepared to leave the ground. But in this row, tension was building instead. The son tried once again, this time more firmly but still polite. "Please understand, my mother cannot be without this. It's not just a random item. It's necessary." His words carried respect but also determination. He wanted to make sure his mother's dignity was not harmed. The flight attendant, however, crossed her arms as if challenging him. The sound of seatbelts clicking and bags being pushed under seats filled the air, but all focus remained on this one spot. The elderly woman tried to settle the matter herself. She lifted the small bottle slightly, her fingers trembling, and said with a fragile smile, "It's only this. It will stay right here with me. I promise it won't disturb anyone." Her voice was almost pleading. But instead of showing compassion, the attendant frowned. She leaned forward and, in one quick motion, picked up the bottle from the tray. The elderly woman gasped softly, reaching out, but the attendant had already turned away. The son stood halfway from his seat, alarmed, his voice firm but calm as he called after her. "Excuse me. That's my mother's medicine." Yet the flight attendant kept walking. The mother's chest tightened, both from shock and fear. She could hardly believe what had just happened. She whispered, "My medicine. I need it." Her son immediately placed a hand on her shoulder, telling her not to worry. But he himself felt anger boiling under his calm surface. He had always taught himself to stay composed, but when it came to his mother's health, he could not stay silent. His eyes followed the attendant, watching as she tossed the bottle into the trash bag she carried. The sound of it hitting the bag felt louder than all the other noises around. The passengers nearby had witnessed everything. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others looked down, avoiding involvement. A child sitting across the aisle whispered to her mother, "Why did she do that?" The mother hushed her, but her eyes too reflected disapproval. Slowly, whispers spread across a few rows. People began to murmur about how unnecessary the act was. The elderly woman sat still, her hands trembling in her lap. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to stay calm, but inside she felt a deep fear. What if she needed her medicine during the flight? What would happen then? The son leaned closer to her, speaking softly, "Don't worry, Mama. I'll fix this." His voice was steady, but his mind was already racing. He could not let this pass. This was not just about rules or procedures. This was about respect and about his mother's right to have what she needed. He looked around the cabin again, and he could sense that other passengers were beginning to share his concern. He knew he had to stand up for her, no matter the cost. At that moment, the plane had not yet moved from the gate. The engines were still quiet, and the flight crew was finalizing their checks. But in the heart of one son, a storm was already gathering. He had promised his mother he would always protect her, and today, that promise was being tested. The elderly woman sat frozen in her seat, staring at the empty tray in front of her as if she could still see the little bottle sitting there. Her hands were trembling, and her lips moved quietly as though she was praying under her breath. Her son, sitting right beside her, leaned closer and tried to calm her. "It's okay, Mama. I'm here. Don't worry," he whispered, though his own heart was beating heavily with anger and worry. He could not believe what had just happened. Something so small, something so necessary, had been taken away so carelessly. The flight attendant, with her stiff posture and unreadable face, walked back down the aisle as if nothing unusual had occurred. She repeated the same instructions to other passengers: "Fasten your seatbelts, put your tray tables up, stow your belongings." But the moment felt heavier in this row. The elderly woman felt a tightness in her chest. She tried to hide it from her son, but he noticed instantly. He held her hand tighter and kept asking if she was all right. She gave him a weak nod, but the fear in her eyes was clear. As minutes passed, the murmurs among passengers grew. Some leaned toward each other, whispering, shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. A man sitting 2 rows back muttered, "That didn't seem right." A woman across the aisle clutched her own bag tighter, as if suddenly worried about her own belongings being taken away. A small group of travelers who had seen everything began exchanging glances, their faces showing both discomfort and sympathy. The son, however, could not let the matter slide. He pressed the call button above his seat. A soft chime rang, and the same flight attendant returned, her expression slightly annoyed. She leaned down, her voice low but still sharp. "Sir, what is the issue now?" The son kept his tone respectful, but his words were firm. "The medicine you threw away is vital for my mother. We need it back immediately." His mother's eyes filled with tears as she listened, but she remained silent, not wanting to make the scene bigger. The flight attendant frowned, almost dismissive. "All items need to be properly stored before takeoff. I told you that already." The son clenched his jaw, trying to stay calm. "This is not just any item," he said slowly, each word clear. This is her medicine. She cannot be without it. You cannot just throw it away. The attendant's eyes narrowed. She looked around, perhaps noticing the watching passengers, and replied in a colder tone, "Sir, please lower your voice. You're disturbing other travelers." The son inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He knew he could not lose his temper, but he also knew he could not allow his mother's health to be risked. The elderly woman tugged gently at his sleeve, whispering, "It's all right, don't make trouble for yourself." But the son shook his head, his eyes never leaving the attendant. "Mama, your health is more important than anything," he said softly. The strength in his voice comforted her, though her worry did not fade. She had always raised him to be respectful, but now she saw him standing with such quiet power, and she felt both proud and fearful at the same time. The attendant refused to budge. She repeated the same instruction about safety rules, as though reciting from a manual, without listening to the actual problem. The son finally said firmly, "I want to speak to the captain. Right now." His words made nearby passengers lift their heads higher, sensing the seriousness of his demand. The attendant's expression stiffened further. "Sir, that's not possible. The captain is preparing for takeoff." The son leaned closer, his voice steady but strong. "Then this plane will not move an inch until my mother has her medicine back." The words hung in the air like thunder. For a moment, the entire cabin seemed to go silent. The passengers looked from the son to the attendant, realizing that something larger was about to unfold. The elderly woman closed her eyes tightly, wishing the earth could swallow her whole. She hated attention, and she hated conflict, but she also knew her son was right. Without her medicine, the flight itself could become dangerous for her. The flight attendant stiffened, clearly unsettled by his declaration. "Sir, if you continue like this, you may face consequences," she said, her voice clipped. But the son did not waver. He raised his voice just enough so that everyone nearby could hear. "My mother's life is more important than a schedule. I will not let this flight take off without her medicine." Passengers started whispering louder now. A young woman sitting a few rows ahead turned and said, "He's right. That was wrong." Another passenger added, "She needs her medicine. You can't just throw that away." The support of others seemed to give strength to the moment. The son straightened in his seat, his calm presence unshaken. He pressed the call button again, and this time another attendant arrived. The first one quickly explained in hushed tones, but it was obvious from the second attendant's surprised face that not everyone on the crew agreed with what had been done. The son repeated his demand clearly, his eyes sharp yet respectful. "Bring my mother's medicine back. Or call the captain. This flight will not leave otherwise." His words carried a weight that filled the cabin. Even those who had not been paying attention earlier now looked alert. A child asked out loud, "Why can't she have her medicine?" and her innocent question made the silence heavier. The elderly woman sat with her hands folded tightly, whispering small prayers under her breath. Her son placed an arm around her shoulders, assuring her again, "I won't let anything happen to you." Minutes passed, but they felt longer. The airplane door was still shut, and the crew had not made the usual announcement about departure. Passengers began to grow restless, some taking out their phones, perhaps recording or messaging about what was happening. The son knew he had created a standstill, but he did not regret it. His mother's health was worth more than the discomfort of a delayed flight. At last, another crew member, this time a supervisor, arrived. She knelt slightly to meet the son's eyes, her tone more professional and calm. "Sir, can you explain what happened?" He took a deep breath and explained everything clearly, from the moment the medicine was on the tray to the moment it was thrown away. He made sure his voice was steady, though the hurt in his heart was clear. "This is not about rules," he concluded. "This is about humanity. You cannot endanger my mother for the sake of convenience." The supervisor looked toward the elderly woman, whose tired face showed how stressed she was. She nodded slightly, her eyes pleading for understanding. The supervisor stood up, clearly realizing the seriousness of the mistake. She excused herself and left quickly. The son sat back down, his body tense but his hand still gently resting on his mother's. "Hold on, Mama. They'll bring it back," he whispered, though his chest tightened with the thought, what if they didn't? Passengers began nodding in agreement, whispering words like unfair, unbelievable, and he's right. A middle-aged man stood up briefly and said, "This shouldn't even be a debate. Give her the medicine back." The air in the cabin shifted again. It was no longer a private conflict. It had become something everyone had witnessed, something that touched each person who imagined their own loved ones in that situation. The elderly woman leaned against her son's shoulder, her breathing uneven, and he gently rubbed her arm, his face set with determination. No matter how long it took, he would not allow the plane to leave the ground until justice was done. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath. The plane was still on the ground, the engines quiet, but inside there was a storm of emotions. The elderly woman sat with her eyes closed, clutching her son's hand, her lips moving in silent prayer. Her son sat upright beside her, his face calm but his mind burning with determination. He had already made it clear, this plane would not move until his mother's medicine was returned. The passengers around them looked restless, but most were now on his side. Some whispered to each other, nodding in agreement. Others glanced at the flight attendant who had started the trouble, their faces showing disapproval. The tension had grown so heavy that every sound seemed louder: the rustle of pages from a magazine, the buzz of an overhead light, the occasional cough. The son pressed the call button again, his finger steady. Another chime rang, and this time the supervisor returned, accompanied by the same flight attendant who had thrown the medicine away. The supervisor's voice was calm, but there was firmness in her tone. "Sir, we are working to locate the item. Please remain patient." The son looked at her steadily. "This is not just an item. This is her medicine. My mother cannot be without it, not even for the length of this flight. I need it back immediately." His voice was not raised, but it carried strength. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, drawn in by his quiet authority. The elderly woman tugged lightly at his sleeve, whispering, "Son, please, don't make too much trouble." Her voice was weak, trembling, but her eyes were filled with both fear and pride. He turned to her, his hand covering hers. "Mama, your life is worth more than anyone's schedule. Don't worry. I will not let them ignore this." The flight attendant beside the supervisor crossed her arms, her face tight with annoyance. She muttered something about safety procedures, but the son ignored her. His attention was on the supervisor. "If she becomes ill because of this, will you be responsible? Will this airline accept that?" His words were like sharp arrows, and they made the supervisor pause. She finally nodded. "I understand. Please give me a few minutes." With that, she walked briskly toward the front of the plane. The passengers sat in silence, waiting. The son kept one hand on his mother's shoulder, the other gripping the armrest tightly. His mother leaned against him, her breathing uneven. He could feel her heartbeat racing, and it made his own chest tighten with worry. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The plane had not pushed back from the gate, and people were beginning to grow impatient. A man sitting in the row behind them finally spoke loudly, "How long does it take to return a bottle of medicine? This is ridiculous." A few passengers murmured their agreement. Another woman said, "She shouldn't even have to wait this long. That medicine should never have been taken away in the first place." The son felt a wave of relief that others were speaking up now. He was no longer just one man fighting for his mother, he had voices of support around him. Still, his jaw remained tight, his mind focused on only one thing, his mother's safety. He could not relax until the bottle was back in her hands. At last, the supervisor returned, holding a small plastic bag in her hand. Inside it was the familiar little bottle. The elderly woman's eyes opened wide, and she gasped softly, her trembling hands reaching out. The supervisor spoke gently, "Here it is, ma'am. We apologize for the inconvenience." The son immediately took the bag, opened it, and handed the medicine to his mother. She held it close to her chest as though it were a treasure, tears shining in her eyes. She whispered a thank you, her voice breaking. The son leaned down and kissed her forehead. "It's okay, Mama. You're safe now." But the matter was far from over. The son looked back at the supervisor, his voice calm but firm. "This should never have happened. Do you realize the danger that was caused? Do you understand what it means to throw away someone's lifeline?" The supervisor's face was troubled. She gave a small nod, but before she could speak, the passengers around began to clap softly. The sound grew louder, filling the cabin with applause. They were not cheering for the crew, they were showing their support for the son and his mother. The flight attendant who had started it all stood stiffly to the side, her face flushed. She looked away, pretending to adjust her uniform. But the son's eyes met hers for a brief moment. He did not shout, he did not insult, but his steady gaze said everything. It was the look of a man who would not forgive disrespect toward his mother. The elderly woman slowly unscrewed the cap of the bottle, her hands still trembling. She took her medicine carefully, sipping water from the small plastic cup the son had given her earlier. As the medicine slid down her throat, she let out a long breath, as though a heavy burden had been lifted. Her body relaxed slightly, and she leaned back in her seat. The son stroked her arm gently, whispering, "It's all right now. Nothing will happen to you while I'm here." The plane remained still, delayed because of the incident. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, worried about missed connections or long waits. But many others seemed moved, even inspired. A young man near the back pulled out his phone and quietly typed something, perhaps sharing the story online. A middle-aged woman leaned across the aisle and said softly to the son, "You did the right thing. Never let anyone take your mother's dignity away." Her words touched him deeply. He nodded politely, his throat tight with emotion. The elderly woman reached for her son's hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. He looked at her, his eyes soft. "I promised I'd always take care of you, Mama. I meant it." But even as relief filled their row, the son knew the situation was not over. He had won back the medicine, but the damage was already done. His mother had been humiliated, her health endangered, and the flight crew had shown a lack of compassion. He resolved quietly in his heart that he would take this further, that he would make sure no other family had to experience what his mother had endured today. The supervisor made a brief announcement over the intercom, apologizing to passengers for the delay. Her words were professional, but everyone knew what had caused it. The son sat back in his seat, his arm still around his mother, his mind already preparing for the next step. He had grounded an entire flight to protect her, and he would do it again if he had to. The elderly woman finally closed her eyes, exhaustion washing over her, but there was a faint smile on her lips. She knew her son's love was her greatest strength. The cabin slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the story of what had happened lingered in the air. Every passenger carried it in their hearts, knowing they had witnessed not just an argument, but a lesson in love, respect, and courage. The cabin had grown quiet again, but the silence was different now. It was not the calm silence of a routine flight preparing to take off, but the heavy silence that follows a storm. Passengers had seen enough to know this was not just a small misunderstanding. It had turned into something bigger, a test of fairness, dignity, and compassion. The elderly woman, now holding her medicine close, leaned back in her seat with her son's arm wrapped gently around her shoulders. She looked calmer, but her heart was still heavy from the humiliation she had felt moments ago. The son, however, did not relax. His eyes stayed sharp, his mind focused. He knew that while his mother had her medicine back, the behavior that had caused this ordeal could not be brushed aside. He could not simply forget how quickly her needs had been ignored, how carelessly something so vital had been tossed away. As he sat there, he decided firmly that the matter had to be addressed properly. If it wasn't, then what would stop it from happening again to someone else? Passengers whispered around them. A few were openly frustrated about the delay, but most seemed to agree that the son had done the right thing. Some even nodded at him when their eyes met, silent gestures of support. A man in business attire leaned forward from a nearby row and said quietly, "You stood up for her. That took courage." The son gave him a polite nod but said nothing. His focus remained on protecting his mother. The supervisor returned once more, her voice calm but her face tense. "Sir," she said carefully, "we understand your concern. The medicine has been returned, and your mother is safe now. We apologize for the misunderstanding. May we now continue with the flight?" The son took a long breath before replying. "This isn't only about the medicine," he said softly, but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This is about how my mother was treated. She was spoken to without respect. Her health was dismissed. That is not something I can overlook." His words were steady, not shouted, yet they carried more power than anger ever could. The supervisor hesitated, aware of the eyes on her. Passengers were no longer passive observers, they were witnesses, and some were clearly prepared to support the son if needed. The son continued, "My mother deserves an apology not just for losing her medicine, but for the way she was treated. She deserves to be seen and respected." The elderly woman tugged at his sleeve again, whispering weakly, "Son, please, it's all right. Let's just go." But he shook his head gently. "Mama, it's not all right. If I stay silent, then they will think it is fine to treat people this way. And it's not." His words made her eyes glisten with tears. She knew he was right, but her humble spirit always preferred peace over conflict. The flight attendant who had caused the problem was standing near the galley, arms folded, her face tight. She avoided looking at the son and his mother, as if she could simply wait out the situation. But the son's firm words made it clear that silence would not be enough this time. The supervisor glanced in her direction, then back at the son. "I understand," she said softly. "I will speak to her." She called the attendant over. The woman walked slowly, her footsteps heavy, her expression a mix of pride and discomfort. She stopped at their row but did not look at the elderly woman directly. The son's steady gaze pushed her to finally meet his eyes. For a long moment, no one spoke. The passengers leaned in, waiting. Finally, the supervisor gave a small nod, urging the attendant to speak. The words came out reluctantly, but they came. "I apologize for taking the medicine," the attendant said flatly. "It was not meant to cause harm." The son tilted his head slightly, unimpressed. He did not want a forced apology. He wanted sincerity. He looked at her calmly and said, "Don't apologize to me. Apologize to my mother. She's the one you hurt." The elderly woman sat quietly, her hands folded around her medicine, her eyes wide. The attendant shifted uncomfortably, then finally turned toward her. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, her voice low. "I should not have taken your medicine." The old woman's eyes softened, and she gave a small nod. "Thank you," she whispered. Her kind heart wanted to end the matter there, but the son was still watching carefully. He did not want vengeance, but he wanted respect to be shown clearly. The passengers around them began murmuring again, some nodding in approval at the apology. The tension loosened slightly, but the son remained alert. He leaned close to his mother and whispered, "You all right now, Mama?" She nodded, giving him a faint smile. "I'm fine now, because of you." With that, the supervisor announced that the flight would soon be ready for departure. But the son was not finished yet. He stood up carefully, adjusting his jacket, and spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I want it known that what happened here was wrong. My mother's medicine was not a toy, not an extra item to be tossed aside. It was her lifeline. No one should be treated as if their needs don't matter. I hope this airline remembers that. The words struck deep, not only in the crew but in the passengers as well. Some clapped softly again, others simply sat in thoughtful silence. The son then sat back down, holding his mother's hand once more. She looked at him with both love and pride. The delay stretched longer, as the airline staff consulted quietly near the front of the plane. The son did not care about time anymore. What mattered to him was that his mother's dignity had been defended. He had grounded the flight not out of anger, but out of love. Eventually, the captain himself came out of the cockpit. He walked down the aisle, his expression professional but kind. He stopped at their row, gave a small respectful bow of his head, and said, "Ma'am, sir, I apologize for what you went through. Your safety and comfort are important to us. We will ensure this does not happen again." The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears at the unexpected gesture. She nodded, whispering a soft thank you. The son also nodded politely, appreciating the captain's sincerity. For the first time since the incident began, he felt a small weight lift from his chest. The plane finally prepared to leave, but the memory of what had just happened lingered in every corner of the cabin. Passengers had witnessed a moment of courage, a son's determination, and a mother's quiet strength. The flight attendant who had caused the issue returned to her duties, quieter now, her steps less forceful. The supervisor gave the family an occasional glance, as though silently checking that they were all right. The elderly woman leaned her head gently on her son's shoulder, whispering, "You stood for me when I could not stand for myself." He kissed the top of her head and replied softly, "That's what sons are for, Mama. I'll always be here." The engines hummed softly as the plane finally began to move. Passengers buckled themselves in tightly, some letting out sighs of relief that the flight was at last leaving the ground. But for the elderly woman and her son, the journey felt different. It was not just another flight anymore, it had become a story of love, dignity, and courage. The mother sat quietly with her medicine held safely in her lap. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the steady vibration of the plane calm her. Her son sat beside her, alert and protective, his eyes glancing from her face to the cabin around them. He had promised himself that nothing else would harm her on this trip. As the plane lifted off, the view outside the window shifted from the grey runway to the soft blanket of clouds above. Some passengers looked out in awe, others pulled out their phones or books, but many still looked now and then toward the elderly woman and her son. The scene earlier had left a mark on everyone, and though people returned to their own routines, they could not easily forget what they had witnessed. The elderly woman rested her head against the seat, her body finally beginning to relax. She whispered to her son, "I never wanted this, you know. I never wanted you to have to fight for me." Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. He squeezed her hand gently and shook his head. "Mama, don't say that. You gave me everything when I was small. You worked hard, you sacrificed, you protected me. Today was just my turn to do the same for you." His words warmed her heart, and tears filled her eyes again. Passengers seated nearby overheard their exchange. Some smiled softly, touched by the son's devotion. A woman sitting across the aisle leaned closer and whispered, "You're blessed to have a son like him." The elderly woman nodded with pride, her tired eyes sparkling with gratitude. The flight attendants moved quietly through the cabin now, their earlier sharpness gone. Drinks were served, snacks passed around, but the energy was different. The crew seemed cautious, aware that all eyes were watching them more closely than before. The son accepted a small cup of water for his mother, helping her take her next dose of medicine. She sipped slowly, her hands trembling less now, her breathing steadier. With every small action, her son made sure she felt cared for and safe. Time passed slowly as the plane cut through the sky. The mother drifted in and out of light sleep, and the son sat still, his thoughts racing. He replayed the incident over and over in his head, each detail burned into his memory. He thought of the fear in his mother's eyes, the arrogance in the flight attendant's voice, the way the medicine had been tossed away as though it meant nothing. His heart tightened at the memory, but then he thought of what followed: the passengers who had spoken up, the supervisor who listened, the captain who apologized. Most of all, he thought of his mother's trembling smile when she held her medicine again. That image gave him peace. As the plane flew over miles of land and sea, the story of what had happened was already beginning to spread. A few passengers had typed out messages on their phones as soon as the Wi-Fi connection was available. Some wrote posts about what they had witnessed, describing the son's courage and the mother's dignity. "A man grounded our entire flight today to protect his elderly mother's medicine," one post read. Another wrote, "Sometimes you see real love in action, and it changes you. That son taught us all a lesson." The story quickly began to travel beyond the cabin, reaching people far away, though the son did not yet know it. Inside the plane, the mood had softened. People who had been strangers at the start of the flight now felt connected through the moment they had shared. Some even smiled kindly at the elderly woman when she walked slowly to the restroom with her son's help. She felt embarrassed by the attention, but the warm smiles reassured her that she was not alone. Hours later, as the plane prepared to land, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be arriving shortly. We thank you for your patience today." His words were professional, but passengers could hear the extra layer of meaning. Patience had been tested not just by a delay, but by something deeper. As the wheels touched down and the plane rolled across the runway, many people glanced once more toward the elderly woman and her son, silently acknowledging the quiet lesson they had witnessed. When the seat belt sign turned off, people stood, stretching and gathering their bags. The son helped his mother rise slowly, making sure she was steady. As they waited to exit, several passengers approached them. A young man said, "Sir, I respect what you did today. You reminded me of how I should treat my own mother." A woman added, "Your courage made a difference. We'll remember this flight not for the delay, but for the love you showed." The elderly woman's cheeks flushed with modesty, and she simply nodded, whispering, "Thank you." Her son gave polite nods as well, grateful for their kindness. When they stepped off the plane, the airport felt different than when they had entered. The son walked slowly, holding his mother's arm, but his steps were firm, his heart lighter. She leaned on him, her body tired but her spirit lifted. Together, they moved through the busy terminal, unnoticed by most travelers but carrying with them a story that had already touched many lives. Later, when they sat quietly in a waiting area, the elderly woman spoke again. "Do you know why I cried today?" she asked softly. The son looked at her, concerned. She gave a faint smile and continued. "It wasn't just because I was afraid without my medicine. It was because I saw you fight for me. I saw your strength, and it reminded me of all the years I prayed you would grow into a good man. Today, I saw the answer to those prayers." The son felt his throat tighten. He placed his hand over hers and whispered, "Mama, everything I am is because of you." They sat together in silence, their bond deeper than ever. By the time they reached their final destination, news of the flight had already begun to spread on social media. Videos and posts described the incident, and thousands of people reacted. Some were angry at the airline for allowing it to happen. Others praised the son for refusing to let the plane move until his mother's health was protected. Many called him a hero, though he never thought of himself that way. To him, it had never been about fame or recognition. It had only been about love. In the days that followed, the airline issued a formal statement, apologizing publicly and promising to review its staff training. The incident became a topic of discussion in newspapers and on television shows. People debated respect, compassion, and the importance of treating every passenger with dignity. But for the son and his mother, the real story was much simpler. It was about one day in the sky, one moment of injustice, and one choice to stand firm in the face of it. The elderly woman kept her medicine close from then on, never letting it leave her side again. Each time she held the bottle, she remembered not just the fear of losing it, but the strength her son had shown. And each time the son looked at her, he remembered the promise he had made not just on that flight, but long before, to always protect her, no matter the cost. And so, the story of that grounded flight lived on. It was told and retold, not only as an account of what went wrong, but as an example of what love can do. For in that plane, in those tense hours, passengers had seen more than a conflict. They had seen a son's love so strong that it stopped an entire journey until his mother's safety was secured. And that kind of love, once witnessed, is never forgotten.